Hello everyone, very warm welcome to Scholar IAS. So we have seen that in the international sphere, there are certain zones of conflict. And in these zones of conflict, we have seen that a lot of international forces are taking part. Now these areas, these hot button areas, are the areas where powerful actors like United States of America, Russia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, are trying to demonstrate their military muscle or are trying to assert their hegemony in a particular region. It could be any region. Syria is one such region which has become a theater of conflict, especially between countries like USA and Russia, to the extent that the country has been completely ravaged and damaged because it has become a zone of conflict and a point of inflammation in the international sphere. So today we are going to take a look at what plagues this part of the country or this part of the world. And we are going to take a look at its relevance and the issues which are underlining the fractures which we are seeing or witnessing in Syria. So this is Rohan welcoming you once again on board to Scholar IAS. Let's begin our topic of the day. So what is the issue? One has to understand the issue first. Now, there has been almost a decade since the outbreak of the crisis in Syria, and Bashar al-Assad, who is the leader, seems to have won the civil war. Right. So let's take a look at the territorial dispute which is going on and how it has transformed the very socio-political and cultural setup of the country. So in 2015, before the Russian intervention, Mr. Assad's area of influence had shrunken to the largely Alawite populated region. Now, from the prelims perspective, they might ask you, because UPSC is always in the habit of mentioning some regions within countries and then expecting the candidates to match them with their host countries. So Bashar al-Assad had a popular majority in the Alawite populated region, stretching from Damascus, which is the Syrian capital, to the Mediterranean coast. Right. But since the last 5 years, we have seen that the troops controlled by Bashar al-Assad, they have taken over most of Syria, except of course for Idlib, which is a territory in Syria, and some Kurdish territories, wherein Kurdish tribal fighters are also active. Kurds enjoy an autonomy in the border region with Turkey, but they have brought a delicate peace with Damascus. So it's some sort of a negotiation. It's some sort of a mutual understanding that we will keep quiet as long as you are accepting our dominance in a particular region. So it's some sort of an understanding. So the Kurds have reached an understanding with the bordering region in Turkey. Now, in effect, the only parts of the country that lie outside the sovereignty of the Syrian government are Idlib, as I've told you, because the Idlib region is controlled by the jihadists who are waging war against the Syrian forces, which are led by Bashar al-Assad, and also some towns on the border that are held by pro-Turkey militias like the Kurds. Okay. Now, what are the ramifications of this? See, now that Mr. Bashar al-Assad has taken over most of Syria, the Syrian army has turned around the war with the help from Russia, Iran, and several Iran-backed Shia militias. We all know that Iran is a Shia majority state, right? So Iran is backing the, what you can say, the Syrian army. Also, Russia and Iran are also helping them. Then who are backing the jihadists? Of course, it is the Israelis and the USA which are backing these jihadists, and this is all happening through a backdoor. Okay, this is not an official war wherein camps are distributed between Russian allies and US allies. No, it's not like that, right? So the civil war now has intensified because Syria has become a proxy battle between Iran and Israel, and Iran and Israel have historically been in a conflict with each other. Okay, so as a result, you see that Iran and Israel conflict is now getting inflamed. Now, has Israel's approach to the crisis changed? So when the Syrian crisis unfolded in 2011-2012, Israel took a wait and watch approach, and this was primarily because it preferred a stable regime in Damascus, which is the capital of what you can say Syria, to post-revolutionary chaos. Right now, there was no formal treaty or there was no formal arrangement, right? So there was a complete absence of that. And despite of that, the Israeli-Syrian border has been largely peaceful since the 1970s. But only after the intervention by Iran, wherein it stepped in with its militia and military assets, Israel changed its approach, because obviously for Israel, any Iranian intervention is going to be detrimental to its hegemony in the region. Okay. And the Israelis are in a timeless and an infinite war with the Muslim world. And we are all aware of that, right? So quite naturally, any movement of Iran in that part of the world would be greatly detrimental to Israel's prospects, and therefore Israel would also make a decisive move, right? Also, it is experts are of the opinion that for Israel also, it is imperative, it's almost imperative to move. It's because Israel's northern border, across the Israel's northern border, the Hezbollah, which is another terrorist organization backed by Lebanon, has already established a formidable presence, and Iran actually endorses and supports and promotes the Lebanese cause, right? So because of the predominance of Hezbollah in Israel's northern border, Israel also has a sense of insecurity, right? So both Israel's 1982 and 2000 occupation of southern Lebanon and the 2006 war on Lebanon were resisted by Hezbollah. And Israel on its part would definitely not like to have more Iran-backed Shia militias across the Golan Heights. Now, Golan Heights is also an area which is in dispute currently, which is held by the Israelis. Okay. In fact, Israel had captured Golan Heights from Syria in 1967 in the famous Six-Day War, right? And since that war, the Golan Heights have now become the de facto border between the two countries, between Syria and Israel. So see, in prelims, they can ask you which of the following marks a de facto border between Israel and what you can say, Syria, and that would be Golan Heights. Because the Golan Heights was taken by Israel from Syria in the 1967 6 Days War, right? So जैसे कि मैंने आपको बताया, Israel was quite inactive and passive, but I would say that since Iran's intervention, Israel has become active owing to certain geopolitical and historical aspects. Okay, so Israel is obviously changing its tactics, and it first started helping the anti-Assad rebels, that is the jihadists in the Golan region, by reportedly providing cash and medical aid. So basically resource mobilization, right? And this was basically to ensure that Golan Heights is created as some sort of a buffer region and is actually isolated from the rest of Syria. That was the objective behind Israel's movement. Okay. And why was this done? This sort of a decisive step was taken to prevent the further march of any pro-Iran militias, right? Because if Iran had moved forward in that area, then it would have definitely confronted the Israeli army, and that would have again led to a inflamed situation, right? So Israeli later in the war started bombing Iranian positions inside Syria. So see, the damage is taking place inside Syria, but actually the war is fought between Iran and Israel, owing to their respective insecurities and owing to their respective geopolitical, what you can say, concerns. Now, since September 2015, the Syrian airspace has practically been controlled by the Russians. Therefore, you will see that a lot of drone strikes are also orchestrated by the Russians over there. But Russia actually looked away when Israel stepped up its bombings against Iran, right? So that kind of mutilated the entire country and created a very grim scenario within Syria. It was a civil war-like situation, and normal life was completely disrupted, right? And see, on its part, Israel has been very, very cautious because it does not want to unnecessarily provoke the Russians and unnecessarily, the Syrian battlefield, which is already jam-packed with a lot of players, it doesn't want to become a part of that because it will also have to bear some sort of collateral damage if it gets involved. It has to be very careful because it can confront Iran, but confronting Russia would be an altogether different ballgame. That would invite a lot of trouble, and that would also destabilize the geopolitical strategy of Israel. Now, what are Israel's goals here? Israel's goals are to disrupt Iranian supplies because Iranian supplies are directly to the advantage of Hezbollah and other Shia militias, which can definitely foment trouble in the border with Lebanon. So another goal, another one, Israel's goal is to stop the militias advancing towards the de facto border, which is the de facto border, Golan Heights. Okay. Now, Israel definitely wants to cripple Iran's strength and Iran's presence in Syria. And it can do so by continuously hammering and by continuously targeting the Syrians. Okay. So Israel has carried out more than a dozen aerial attacks in Syria. And in retaliation, Syria has also often fired anti-aircraft missiles. Perhaps they were provided by Russia or Iran, right? Now, if you talk about Iran's role for the Syrian government, support from Iran was a lifeline. Okay, because obviously Syria does not have the kind of military wherewithal that Iran has. And Russia also provided air assistance. Iran supplied troops on the ground, right? So the leader, which is Bashar al-Assad, he did nothing to prevent the what you can see ever-growing Iranian influence in his country, in spite of the fact that Israel was raising alarm bells about it, right? And as Israel was trying to dissipate any kind of trouble coming from Syria, Iran's response to Israeli attacks was to deepen its own footprint. So unnecessarily, Syria became that ring, that battleground between Israel and Iran, because it became some sort of a geopolitical contest in West Asia, because both the countries want to become regional players in West Asia, right? So Syrian civil war has a lot to do with the geopolitical contest in West Asia. This could also be asked for you, or the UPSC can ask you to elaborate this in the mains in GS paper 2. So already the conflict has spilled from Syria into the Mediterranean and the Red Sea waters, where both Iran and Israeli navies are in a zone of conflict with each other. And in all, the Israel-Iran contest is set to intensify further, with Israel determined to contain Iran. Are also reaching out, right? Why? Because US has its own interest with Iran as regards the sanctions put on, what you can say, Iran as regards its nuclear deal. Talk about Indo-Japan relationship. So till the time we meet next, this is Rohan Dange, signing off from Skholar IAS. Thank you. Take care. Stay safe and stay home.